So here's the rubber, here's the model, here's the cartilage model. Cells start to die, bone cells move in, start forming here, right? Until the ends are all that's left of cartilage. And then at some point, you only have these two regions at the proximal and distal ends of the metaphysis, right? Called the epiphyseal plate over here, right? This zone of cartilage over here. And this is where the growth is going to occur. It's going to make this bone grow into this longer one over here. So what's happening over here is that this is where the elongation, chondrocytes are going to continue to divide. Okay, here is bone, and let's see, here's a couple layers of chondrocytes. Here's the epiphysis over here. Here's the shaft of the bone, and here's that epiphyseal plate. Right? And so what's going to happen is cartilage, these cartilage over here near the epiphysis, these cells are going to grow. And what that's going to do is push up this plate a little bit. Right. So when we start off, right, so we've added a layer over here, but the other thing we're going to do is these cells over here are going to die off, right? And they're going to be replaced by bone, right? So this is bone. These are bone cells over here. All right, so now you see this, the width of this epiphyseal growth plate is going to stay the same because of this. You're going to have another growth on this side, which is going to push up this a little more. Right? And then the cells over here are going to die off and be replaced by bone tissue, right? And then it's going to happen again. You're going to grow up here. This is going to get moved up. And these cells are going to die off, right? And then guess what's going to happen? You're going to have another growth over here. Oops, these were already bone growth over here. And let's say this one's going to die right here. And so if this was basically if this was the extent of the growth over here, right? These cells over here would keep dying and then not be replaced on this side at the end of the growth right there, right? So by the end, you're left with all bone right here and this new bone right here, growing this much in length right here. All right, so that's how this is occurring right here. It's growing on one end, dying on the other end, right? And so that's what's happening in this. Cells over here on the top are growing. These cells are dying and being replaced by bone. Does that make sense how this might happen right here? How you might go at this end over here. They're proliferating, basically proliferating, pushing the bone up while these cells on the end are dying right there. And then eventually these will just keep dying and not proliferating on the end. And all you're left is with is that growth epiphyseal line over there. Right, so this is interstitial growth, right? The growth, here's a kid's bone over here, right? Their bones haven't grown out yet, right? They're not quite touching. What you can't see here is the cartilage, right? That would have been there. All these plates right over here. And then when you're grown, all these grow out together to form the joints. Right, so you're looking at something like this, starting, growing, right? All the while this is staying the same width. And then eventually the death on this side and bone replacement will catch up to that growth. And then that growth plate will be gone once you're done growing. All right, is there any questions on how that whole process works of interstitial growth? And this is the whole thing. New cartilage forms on this side, right? Cartilage becomes bone on the other side. So when I was talking about these two syndromes, right, or disorders, right, in this case, there was excessive growth at the epiphyseal plate, right? And since that's mainly affecting the long bones, these people have really long limbs. They have a lot of other problems with their heart and stuff like that. But that's one of the main problems. It's a genetic thing. Something about that growth plate wasn't working or was overworking, right? Maybe the cells weren't dying, or maybe it was just happening too fast, right? And then the opposite thing, you had really slow while the rest of the body was developing fairly normally, right? The limbs, right? Those growth plates at all the limbs and fingers and everything were growing very short, very slowly as that process proceeded, right? So that all had to do with, the growth plates at the epiphyseal plate. The other thing about that is, this is a picture of one of those mass grave sites they find, and they look, if you could look over here, you can actually see the mummified head of somebody. And then they look at these bones and they're very kind of small bones. And they ask themselves, is this a child or is a short adult? And so if you look over here, you can actually make out once you get to recognize these bones, right? This is a tibia. Over here, here's a femur. Over here, and if you look at this split right over here, you can actually see the epiphyseal growth plate, right? So this, same thing over here, right? This is the kid's knees, right? Over here, right? And you can actually make out on the tibia over here, that growth plate. So if you had that growth in length, you just have a really long skinny bone if it wasn't also widening at the same time, right? So it's going to grow proportionate as it grows right there. So as it grows longer, you also have to widen, thicken the bone right there, right? So this is called the widening of the bone. It's called appositional growth versus interstitial growth, right? And this is occurring on the outside over here, as well as it's going to be occurring around the endosteal, that covering around the bone right over there, right? So basically what's happening here is osteoblasts, right, are going to lay bone around the outside here. I guess if you draw this, you'd have this layer. Over here, which would be, this layer. If this was the outside layer over here, you add a new growth. This would be this layer right here. And then by the time as the time it goes over here, this whole thing would be the inside over here, right? So the bone is being laid down on the outside, but it's also, at the same time, the medullary cavity is going to stay proportionate as well, right? Because on the inside here, as the outside's growing, their osteoclast activity is also widening the medullary cavity. So your bone isn't growing necessarily thicker, compact bone here, right? It's just widening the whole thing, right? By increasing stuff on the outside. And that was that. This would be this. So if you looked at the rings, right, you'd have this one over here. Well, this doesn't look like it's much, but it's a little bit bigger, right? And until eventually that, the growth over here is, the widening of the medullary cavity will keep this sort of proportional over here, right? So this is what's happening during appositional growth. And then if you looked at what was happening, bone deposited on the osteoblast on the outside, removed by osteoclast. And this is a little bit complicated. Don't worry so much about the details here but there's also a cool video if you want to find that link right there. This is an animation of this. I hesitate to show it to you because some of the comments are things like, this took me 2 minutes to learn what they were talking about while my dumb professor took me an hour, right? But that's basically, if you watch the animations of these, you'll get a better sense of what's actually going on here, right? So you have this, remember those rings around the whole bone, right? Those circumferential lamella. This is where the bone is being added on the outside. And so over here, you see these circumferential lamella. There's a blood vessel running alongside it. Right? If you follow this right over here, you'll see it. You can think of this as a big wave that's collapsing, like circling around this bone, right? But it's growth, right? That's growing over this hole. And so as it grows over this, these longitudinal blood vessels, they become encircled. Okay, so this is that same hole right over here that is eventually going to be moved deeper inside as it grows on the outside right here. And you can see how the actual blood vessels, are being formed in those central canals in this fashion. Again, do you really have to know this? I'm not going to ask you any particular questions, but that's how it's happening on the outside. And that's how you don't just have the circumferential lamella, that's how you keep on getting new osteons as the bone goes thicker. All right, so bottom line is this interstitial growth, right? In that epiphyseal growth plate, new cartilage formed, bone formed on the other side. That's going to push that whole shaft up. At the end of that process, once you're done with growing, right, which most people is no more than like 20 years old or so, that all that's left over here is the articular cartilage on both ends. You have the epiphyseal line as a remnant of that epiphyseal growth plate. If there's no more cartilage, there's no more bone growth going on in that case. Right? So that's it for life. Your bones aren't getting any longer no matter what you do at that point. Right? Whereas appositional growth, you can model your bones like that. And especially, you could increase one side versus the other, right? So this can continue throughout your life, this appositional growth. All right, so I think, that's it. That's all I wanted to say about bone growth.